from Jadon Consulting, and in this video we'll talk about stakeholders and why do they matter in the project. Let's get started. Now here is the agenda for today. We'll start talking about who are stakeholders, and then we'll talk about how do we identify those stakeholders, and then once we identify them, how do we track those stakeholders, and how do we prioritize stakeholders by analyzing them, and finally how do you engage those prioritized stakeholders. We'll start with who are stakeholders. We hear the word stakeholders a lot in our projects. It is probably the most abused term in project management. A lot of people think that customers are the only stakeholders in the project. Many other places people think that senior management are the only stakeholders. But let us look at a broader perspective from project management as a practice in general. Let's look at a simple definition. Anyone who has a stake or interest in the project is a stakeholder, right? That's probably as simple as it can get. What does the PMI say? The PMI says that an individual, group or organization who may be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision, activity or outcome of a project, program or portfolio is a stakeholder. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Now, the ISO 21500 says that a stakeholder is any individual, group or organization impacted by or impacting the project. I like this one. Now we know who are stakeholders. Now let's try to identify stakeholders. Enough of definitions, let's look at some examples. Let's consider a scenario where we have a software development project which is delivering a mobile app. Let's try and identify stakeholders aligning with PMI definition. Now let's look at stakeholders who affect the project. The project team affects the project. They are stakeholders because they are the ones who deliver and impact the project. The contractors affect the project as well. And you as a project manager can affect the project by your decisions. So you are also a stakeholder. Now let's look at stakeholders who are affected by the project. The customer is affected by the project. He receives your handover and the deliverables. The end user, if you are delivering a product, is also affected by the product as he is impacted by it. So he is also a stakeholder. And finally, who are those stakeholders who are being perceived as stakeholders? An example can be the IT team. The IT team can foresee that they will be impacted as they have to set up the infrastructure for our mobile application. Now, a word on this. The IT team may assume themselves to be stakeholders or being impacted by the project. It is safer to let them be considered as stakeholders than to ignore them as stakeholders and later realize potential changes coming from them. Now, what does the best practice say? Best practice says the sooner you identify the stakeholders in the project lifecycle, the better. And why is it so? This is because the cost of change in a project is higher as it is introduced later in the project. The later you introduce a stakeholder to project, the higher are the chances of introducing change. Now, where do we track these identified stakeholders? The formal document popularly christened by PMI is Stakeholder Register. Now, this can be a Word document or even an Excel sheet. I personally prefer Excel sheet to track stakeholders. Now, here is an example. You can see the columns like name, title, and role in the project, but the most important among these are influence on the project and supported. We will talk more on this when we talk about stakeholder analysis. Now that we have identified stakeholders, let us see how we can manage them. Imagine having hundreds of stakeholders in a project. It would be a nightmare to manage them with equal importance, engaging them with equal energy. But how will you deal with the situation as general project management practice says all stakeholders are important? The best way to solve this problem is to analyze and prioritize your stakeholders, and for that we have certain stakeholder analysis tools. Some of the most popular ones are power versus interest grid, salience model, and directions of influence. Now, power versus interest grid is a two-dimensional graph measured by the power of the stakeholder and their interest in the project. You can see in this example the stakeholder Ramesh and Shiva hold high power and high interest in the project. And you can see there is a hint that they have to be managed closely by the project manager. You can see other stakeholders here. John, Mark and Peter, they are high power and low interest and they need to be kept satisfied. Jennifer and Anita are low power and low interest stakeholders and we need to monitor them. And finally, Uday, Narendra and Nicholas, they are high interest and low power stakeholders. You need to keep them informed. Now, salience model is another tool, and in this case we use 3 attributes to analyze each and every stakeholder: power, urgency and legitimacy. Power is the level of influence the stakeholder has on the project. Urgency is the stakeholder has with the project outcome. And finally, legitimacy is the level of relevance and appropriateness the stakeholder is to the project. And as you can see in this example, you may have stakeholders who have pure power, like you can see in number 1, and they do not have either urgency or legitimacy with the project. So you can call them as dormant stakeholders. You can see stakeholders with pure legitimacy and no power or urgency. You can call them as discretionary stakeholders. You can see stakeholders with pure urgency. They do not have power or influence on the project, nor are they relevant to the project in terms of legitimacy. You can call them as demanding. Now this is not black and white. You also have gray areas, right? So you may have stakeholders who are a combination of power and legitimacy. You can call them as in number 4, they are dominant stakeholders. You can have stakeholders who have power and urgency with the project, and in my opinion as well, they can be dangerous. And finally, you have stakeholders who have both urgency and legitimacy with the project, and they are dependent on you since they do not have influence on the project. And for any stakeholder who has all 3, power, urgency and legitimacy, they are called definitive. And there are few of them in your project, like your custom manager or your project sponsor. Directions of influences is another tool for stakeholder analysis, and in fact you can use directions of influences for identifying stakeholders. Now it is a 360-degree roundup around the project manager. As you can see, the project manager toward his sidewards, he has his peer managers and communities of practice. They are stakeholders as well, as they can influence the project by sharing resources and sharing with you the best practices in the project. Now downwards to the project manager, you have project team. They do influence the project, there are no question about that. And you have to the outwards, the vendors, the customers, the regulatory authority, they do influence the project as well. And finally, upwards to the project manager, you have the senior management, the project sponsors, the governance committee or the steering committee. They do have heavy influence on the project. They are also stakeholders as well. So this is an interesting way to identify stakeholders and categorize them and analyze them. Now that we have categorized stakeholders, the next step is to engage them. And we are going to talk about 2 particular engagement tools: the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix and the Communication Plan. The Engagement Matrix, also known as Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix, here we track the current engagement level of every stakeholder as well as the desired engagement level. As we can see in this example, Ramesh is currently unaware of the project, which means he may not even know that a project exists and what the outcomes are. And your desired engagement level is supportive. So you need to talk with Ramesh and make him be aware of the project and the outcomes of the project, and have an engagement plan where you can move him towards to be the supportive stakeholder of the project. Anita here is neutral, which means she is aware of the project, but she is neither supportive nor neutral. Now in this case, you want Anita to be leading the project from the front. John here is resistant to the project. John and Narendra are very important. You do not want any stakeholders to be resistant. So you need to talk with John and Narendra and understand their concerns and try and see if you can address their concern if there are any, and make them at least supportive of the project. In this case, that happens to be the desired engagement level of the stakeholders. Communication plan is another engagement tool. It is essential as engagement has to be timely. Now a communication plan helps us out in planning what needs to be communicated, when, to whom it needs to be communicated, and by whom should this be communicated. Now if you look at this example, we have the project kickoff meeting, which is supposed to be held in the project beginning, and it is supposed to be communicated to all stakeholders, and it should be initiated by the PMO. The steering committee meeting is supposed to be held once in a month, and the governance team is supposed to be invited by the PMO. The status reporting, here it is scheduled for a weekly meeting where the project team is supposed to be addressed by the project manager. And finally, the customer satisfaction survey is held once in a quarter where the customer is supposed to be addressed by the sponsor. Now, the key to the project success lies in the fact that the stakeholders are happy. So make sure you identify them as soon as possible, manage them, analyze them, and engage them in a timely manner. If you like this video, you can like, share and subscribe. Thank you. If you are interested in our certification prep courses, you can click the link in the description. For experienced and professional project managers, we have the PMP prep course. For Agile project managers, we have the Agile ACP prep course. And for beginners in project management, we have the CAPM PMI prep course.